The phone rang just as I was about to wrap up a meeting with a supplier. I glanced at the screen and saw the number for Henry's school. The principal had called maybe once before in the past year, so I answered immediately, excusing myself from the room. Mr. Blake? This is Mrs. Carter, the school nurse. Henry's feeling quite ill, looks like it might be the flu. He's running a fever, and we really need someone to pick him up. Of course, I said, my pulse quickening. Have you tried reaching Allison? We did, she said apologetically, but there was no answer at home or on her cell phone. I hesitated. Allison should have been reachable. Her work as a freelance photographer meant she was usually home during the day, especially on a Wednesday. I'll leave now, I replied, already gathering my things. The 15-minute drive to the school was enough time for my mind to start filling in gaps. Maybe she was in the backyard with the dog, or perhaps she had silenced her phone while editing photos. I shoved the thought aside. It wasn't like Allison to miss calls about the kids. By the time I arrived at the school, Henry was slumped in a chair outside the nurse's office, his cheeks flushed and his breathing heavy. He looked up and gave me a weak smile. Dad, I feel awful. I know, buddy. I crouched down and touched his forehead. It was burning. Let's get you home. Pulling into the driveway, I immediately noticed the sleek black Audi parked in the space where Allison's Jeep should have been. I frowned. We didn't own an Audi, and I couldn't think of anyone who might visit her in the middle of the day. Henry, I said carefully, I want you to stay in the car for a second, okay? But Dad, I feel sick. I know, buddy, but I need to check something real quick. I'll be fast, I promise. I stepped out and closed the door gently, my stomach nodding as I approached the house. The garage door was open, and Allison's Jeep was inside, confirming she was home. So, whose car was this? The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside, scanning the living room. It was eerily quiet. Normally, the hum of the washing machine or the distant sound of music editing software filled the space. Today, there was nothing but the faint creak of the floor beneath my feet. As I climbed the stairs, I began to hear voices, muffled but distinct. A man and a woman. At the top of the landing, the bedroom door was slightly ajar. I could see a sliver of movement through the gap. I leaned in closer, and their words became clear. I've never felt so alive before, Allison said, her voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard in years. You're the only one who really sees me. The man's laugh was low and self-assured. You deserve it, Allison. You deserve someone who appreciates all of you. The air left my lungs in a rush, and I felt my pulse pound in my ears. I pushed the door open slightly, just enough to see them. Jared. He owned a fitness center downtown, and I recognized him immediately from the holiday charity gala. They were on the bed, entangled in a way that left no room for doubt. My legs felt like lead, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. Every fiber of my being screamed to storm in, to yell, to make them see me standing there. But I didn't. Not yet. I stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and descended the stairs. My mind raced. Was this the first time? How long had it been going on? And why my bed? I returned to the car and climbed in, forcing a smile for Henry. Let's get you to Grandma's, okay? After settling Henry at my mother's, I drove aimlessly for hours, my thoughts a hurricane of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. When I finally returned home, it was past dinner. Allison greeted me with a cheerful, "Hey, how's Henry?" as though nothing had happened. I studied her, my wife of 10 years, the mother of my children, and tried to reconcile her face with the one I had seen just hours before. I made an excuse about being too tired to eat and retreated to the office. That night, as I sat in the dim glow of my desk lamp, Henry's iPad pinged with a notification. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to look. Opening the device, I found it synced to Allison's account. Messages filled the screen, threads of texts and photos that left nothing to the imagination. Jared's name was on each one. I can't stop thinking about earlier. You're incredible. I miss you already. The final nail was a photo of them together, taken in my living room, laughing. My hands clenched so tightly around the iPad that I nearly cracked the screen. My heart wasn't just breaking, it was dissolving into a searing rage. But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't confront her tonight. I needed a plan, and when I was done, they would both regret ever crossing me. The next morning, I woke early, my head buzzing with fragments of what I'd seen and read. I didn't know if it was the adrenaline or the sheer anger coursing through me, but I hadn't managed more than a few hours of sleep. The evidence on Henry's iPad kept playing in my mind like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. I had to act, and I needed help. Carter was the only person I trusted enough for what I had in mind. We've been friends since high school, and if there was one thing Carter was good at, it was technology. He was the type of guy who could build a computer out of spare parts or hack into a network for fun, though he swore he never used his skills for anything illegal. By 8 a.m., I was at his doorstep, coffee in hand. He opened the door wearing a faded Denver Broncos hoodie and a pair of sweats. "Evan? This early? What's going on? Can I come in?" He stepped aside, concern creasing his brow. "Sure. You look like you've been hit by a truck." "I feel like it," I muttered, walking into his kitchen. I placed the coffee on the counter and leaned against the fridge. "Spill," he said, crossing his arms. "It's Allison," I started, my voice low but steady. "She's cheating on me." Carter's eyes widened. "What? Are you sure?" I nodded. "I caught her yesterday with Jared, that gym guy." He looked incredulous. "The one who runs that overpriced place downtown?" "Yeah, him." I found them together in our bedroom. Carter let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Jesus, man, I'm so sorry." I held up a hand. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I need your expertise. I need proof. Solid, undeniable proof." "Proof for what? Divorce? Custody? Revenge?" I said bluntly. He stared at me for a moment, then nodded. "All right. What's the plan?" An hour later, we were at my house. Carter had a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, packed with the tools of his trade: miniature cameras, wireless mics, and other gadgets I couldn't begin to name. We started in the bedroom. Carter positioned a small camera on the top corner of the bookshelf, angled to capture the bed. He added another one inside the ceiling vent for a secondary view. "You sure about this?" he asked as he adjusted the lens. "Positive," I said, standing by the door. "They're bold enough to use my house. My bed. I want every second recorded." He nodded and moved to the living room. "Here too?" "Yeah," I said. I saw a picture of them on the couch. Apparently, it's a popular spot. Carter smirked, though his eyes were full of sympathy. "Got it." "In the office." I hesitated. "She works there a lot. I need to know if she's using it to communicate with him." "Easy enough." He placed another camera on a high shelf, concealed behind a row of books. The last part of the plan involved Allison's car. While Carter set up the sync for all the devices to upload data to a secure cloud folder, I worked on placing a small voice-activated recorder under the driver's seat of her Jeep. "This thing is sensitive," Carter explained as he joined me. "It'll pick up any conversation she has in the car. It's not perfect, but it'll give you a good idea of what's going on." "Good," I said, straightening up. "I need to know everything." By the time Allison returned from a supposed photo shoot later that afternoon, everything was in place. I spent the rest of the day pretending to be buried in work emails, glancing at her occasionally as she moved around the house. At dinner, she seemed cheerful, maybe even overly so. She hummed to herself as she served the kids' plates and asked me about my day with a smile that almost made me doubt what I knew. "Busy," I replied shortly. She raised an eyebrow. "Still swamped with a new project?" "Something like that." I picked at my food, keeping my tone neutral. "How was your day?" "Oh, the usual," she said breezily. "Editing, errands, a quick stop at the store. Nothing too exciting." I looked up and met her gaze. Her smile didn't falter, but I noticed the slight twitch in her fingers as she adjusted her napkin. "How's Henry doing?" she asked, changing the subject. "Better. Mom said he's resting and the fever's down." "Good. I'll check on him tomorrow." Her nonchalance grated on me, but I forced myself to stay calm. The truth would come out soon enough. That night, as she worked on her laptop in the office, I sat in the living room with Henry's iPad. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but the device seemed to hold an endless stream of breadcrumbs. And then I found it. An email. From Allison to Jared. "I can't wait for our weekend at the cabin. I need to get away with you. Just the two of us. Can you book it for next month? My jaw tightened as I read the message over and over. A cabin. She wasn't just risking everything for fleeting moments. She was planning a future with him. I closed the iPad and leaned back against the couch, the storm inside me growing stronger. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it demanded nothing less than complete and total retribution. The following morning, I left the house early under the pretense of heading into the office. Allison was still asleep when I slipped out, her phone charging on the nightstand next to her. I had checked it once before, carefully and quietly, but it found little beyond what I already knew. She was meticulous about deleting messages, but the sync devices had already given me more than enough to paint a picture. I wasn't going to work, though. I drove to a nearby coffee shop, found a quiet corner table, and opened my laptop. Carter had set up everything the day before, linking the cameras and recorders to a secure cloud storage account. I logged in and braced myself. The feed from the previous day started innocuously enough. Allison wandering through the house, checking her email, editing photos in her office. But then, just after noon, Jared arrived. The bedroom feed flickered on. They were standing by the bed, too close for comfort. I can't believe we keep getting away with this, Jared said, smirking as he sat on the edge of the bed. It's easier than you think, Allison replied, brushing her hand along his shoulder. Evan's so busy with work, and he never asks questions. He's oblivious. Oblivious. The word hit me like a slap. They didn't waste time. Jared pulled her onto his lap, and the conversation dissolved into something I couldn't stomach watching. I fast-forwarded through the footage, stopping only when I heard Allison's voice again. You're the only one who makes me feel alive, she said breathlessly as they lay side by side. Evan's comfortable, but with you, it's like I can breathe again. Comfortable. Breathe again. The phrases rattled around in my head, stoking a fire that had been smoldering since yesterday. Later in the footage, I saw them move to the living room. The camera caught them lounging on the couch, laughing like it was their private getaway. Do you think he'll ever figure it out? Jared asked, running his hand along the back of the couch. No, Allison said with a laugh. Even if he did, he wouldn't do anything about it. He's predictable, always trying to keep the peace. Predictable, huh? I muttered under my breath, clicking through the files. The damning evidence wasn't just the videos. The audio from the car recorder added a new layer. In one clip, Jared and Allison discussed a gym equipment delivery. I hope you like the new treadmill, Allison said. I used a joint card for it, so technically Evan's paying for it. Jared chuckled. Perfect. Tell him thanks for me. I paused the playback, gripping the edge of the table. She had bought him equipment with our shared funds, my money. I logged into our bank account and scanned the transactions. Sure enough, a $2,300 charge for a high-end fitness retailer popped up, along with several other suspicious purchases. I closed the laptop and sat back, staring out the window at the passing cars. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was financial, deliberate, and shameless. Every purchase, every laugh, every touch they shared was a knife in my back. I spent the rest of the morning taking action. First, I transferred half of our savings into a new account under my name only. Next, I canceled all our joint credit cards and requested a replacement for myself. Finally, I scheduled an appointment with a divorce lawyer for the following week. When I returned home that evening, Allison was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up and smiled. Hey, how was work? Long, I said, setting my keys on the counter. Everything okay? She asked, tilting her head. Just the usual. Deadlines, clients, the never-ending grind. She nodded, turning back to the cutting board. Henry called earlier. He's feeling much better. He wants to come home tomorrow. That's good, I said, grabbing a glass of water. For a moment, I just watched her. She moved with practiced ease, humming softly as she worked. Anyone else would see a loving wife preparing dinner for her family. But I knew better. So, I said casually, what did you do today? She didn't miss a beat. Oh, just errands and photo editing. Nothing exciting. Sounds productive, I replied, hiding the edge in my voice. Yeah, well, somebody has to keep things running around here, she said with a laugh. I smiled faintly and took my water to the living room, my mind already racing with plans for what came next. That night, as I reviewed the footage again, I realized I had more than enough evidence. But this wasn't just about gathering proof anymore. This was about control. If Allison thought I was predictable, she was in for a rude awakening. Allison approached me in the kitchen one morning with her usual air of lighthearted ease, which I now recognized as a carefully practiced mask. She was holding a flyer in one hand, the kind printed on glossy cardstock that charities use to reel in affluent donors. "There's a charity event on Saturday," she said, setting the flyer on the counter and sliding it toward me. "It's an outdoor fundraiser at the country club. We should go. It'll be good to get out together." I glanced at the flyer without touching it. Country club? I didn't realize we were members. "We're not," she said quickly, her tone bright. "But Jared is, and he offered to get us in as guests." "Of course he did." I kept my expression neutral. "Why would Jared invite me?" "He invited both of us," she replied with a soft laugh. "You know how these things work. Networking, socializing. It's for a good cause." Her words were so casual, so breezy, that for a fleeting moment, I wondered if she really thought I was blind. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, her audacity would be her undoing. I nodded slowly, as though I were weighing my options. "All right, let's go. It's been a while since we've had a night out." Her smile widened. "Great. You'll see, it'll be fun." I doubted that very much. On Saturday evening, I dressed in a tailored suit that Allison had once said made me look like a man who knows what he's doing. The irony wasn't lost on me. She wore a sleek black dress with a plunging neckline, her hair swept up in a style that she saved for special occasions. "You look incredible," she said as I adjusted my tie in the mirror. "So do you," I replied, my voice smooth and even. The drive to the country club was uneventful. Allison chatted about the fundraiser, throwing in details about the golf course and the guest list. I listened without commenting, my mind focused on the manila envelope tucked securely in my jacket pocket. When we arrived, the parking lot was already full of luxury cars. Jared's black Audi was parked near the entrance, and Allison's eyes flicked toward it for the briefest of moments before she turned to me with a bright smile. "Ready?" she asked, looping her arm through mine. "Always." The event was exactly what I expected. Expensive wines, delicate hors d'oeuvres, and a crowd that radiated wealth and self-importance. Jared was easy to spot, standing near the bar with a glass of scotch in hand. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, the kind that screamed bespoke tailoring. By his side was Melissa, his wife, a striking blonde whose icy blue eyes scanned the room with the precision of a hawk. As we moved through the crowd, Allison waved at Jared, her smile lingering just a second too long. "Let's get a drink," I said, steering her toward the opposite side of the bar. While she chatted with a pair of acquaintances, I slipped away, weaving through the crowd until I reached Melissa. She was mid-conversation with a man I didn't recognize, but her gaze shifted to me as I approached. "Melissa, right?" I asked, extending my hand. She hesitated briefly before shaking it. "Yes. And you are?" "Evan," I said. "We've met once or twice before. I'm here with Allison." Her polite smile faltered slightly at the mention of Allison's name. "Ah, yes. I remember now. I need to show you something," I said quietly, pulling the envelope from my pocket. "It's important." She glanced at it warily. "What is this?" "Proof," I said simply. Her eyes narrowed, but she took the envelope and opened it. As she sifted through the photos and printouts of text messages, her expression shifted from confusion to horror to barely contained fury. "What the hell is this?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "Exactly what it looks like," I replied. "They've been seeing each other for months. I thought you should know." She looked up at me, her eyes blazing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve better," I said, my voice calm. "And because I'm done playing the fool." Melissa clenched her jaw and closed the envelope. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode toward Jared, her movements swift and deliberate. The confrontation unfolded like a scene from a soap opera. Melissa slammed the envelope onto the bar, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. "Care to explain this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a knife. Jared's confident demeanor cracked as he glanced at the envelope, then at her. "Melissa, I don't know what— Don't you dare lie to me," she snapped. "I have the proof right here. You and her." Her gaze darted to Allison, who had frozen mid-sentence, her face draining of color. "Melissa, let's not do this here," Jared said, his tone pleading. "Oh, we're doing this right here," Melissa shot back. "You've been sneaking around with her, humiliating me, and you think I'm just going to keep smiling and pretending everything's fine?" The room fell silent as the crowd turned to watch the unfolding drama. Allison looked at me, her eyes wide with panic, but I didn't move. "Let's go," Jared muttered, grabbing Melissa's arm. "Don't touch me," she said, jerking away. "We're done, Jared." "And you," she said, pointing at Allison. "You're disgusting." With that, Melissa stormed out, leaving Jared and Allison standing in the center of the room, their humiliation on full display. We drove home in silence. Allison's hands trembled in her lap, and her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke. "Evan, save it," I said, cutting her off. "You'll want to rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." I stepped out of the car and went inside, leaving her sitting alone in the dark. The next morning, the lawn became my canvas. I dragged the bed frame, the couch, and the kitchen table onto the grass, each piece accompanied by a large, bold sign. Photographs were stapled to the signs, images of Allison and Jared caught in the act. By midday, neighbors began to gather, murmuring and pointing as they read the signs. The morning after my public display of justice, I woke early. The house was quiet, too quiet. Allison hadn't come to bed, and I didn't care enough to check where she'd gone. Maybe she was curled up on the couch, too ashamed to face me. Or maybe she'd gone somewhere to cry about her ruined reputation. Either way, I had work to do. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching as the first curious neighbor ventured onto the lawn. Mrs. Parker, from 2 doors down, squinted at the sign by the bed, her mouth forming a small O as she registered the photographs. She glanced back at her husband, who stood awkwardly on the sidewalk, then gestured for him to come closer. Within an hour, a small crowd had gathered. Some were trying to act nonchalant, as if they were simply out for a morning walk, but others made no effort to hide their gawking. Phones were raised, taking pictures or videos of the spectacle. By the time Allison finally appeared, still in her bathrobe and slippers, the crowd had grown to nearly a dozen people. She froze on the front porch, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned against the doorframe, sipping my coffee. "I'd call it the truth," I said. She turned to me, her face pale. "Evan, take this down. Please." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Why? Embarrassed?" "You weren't embarrassed in front of Jared." "This is different," she snapped, her voice rising. "The neighbors don't need to see this. They already have," I said calmly. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before inviting someone into my house." She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of a camera shutter stopped her. She glanced at the street, where Mrs. Parker was now openly taking photos of the signs. Allison's shoulders slumped, and she turned back inside without another word. By mid-afternoon, the fallout had begun. The whispers I'd expected were now full-blown conversations, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. I stepped outside briefly to move the couch closer to the street, ensuring no one would miss the sign attached to it. As I adjusted the positioning, Mr. Dalton from across the street approached me. "Evan," he said, his voice low, "I don't mean to pry, but is this real?" I met his gaze. Every word of it. He nodded slowly, his expression a mix of pity and intrigue. "Well, I'll tell you one thing. It takes guts to do what you're doing." "Guts," I repeated with a faint smile. "Or desperation. Either way," he said, glancing at the signs, "people are talking. If you need anything, thanks," I said, cutting him off. I wasn't interested in sympathy. That evening, Carter came by. He parked a block away, knowing his car would be noticed, and entered through the back door. "Hell of a show you're putting on," he said, dropping onto a bar stool in the kitchen. "Not a show," I replied, sitting across from him. "Just making sure the truth gets out." "Well, it's working," he said. "Jared's gym is already taking a hit. I checked their website this morning. People are leaving reviews about his extracurricular activities. Good, I said. But that's not all, Carter continued. I did some digging like you asked. Turns out Jared's been dipping his toes into other waters. I leaned forward. Go on. There's a pattern, Carter said. Over the past couple of years, at least 3 female clients have left his gym after some pretty questionable interactions. One of them even posted about it anonymously in a fitness forum. Nothing explicit, but enough to make you wonder. Names? I asked. He shook his head. None were listed. But I could track down the forum threads, maybe find a way to link them back to him. Do it, I said without hesitation. Carter nodded, then hesitated. Are you sure about this, Evan? I mean, ruining his reputation is one thing, but if this blows up, it could what? I interrupted. Cost him his business? His social standing? His life as he knows it? I leaned back, my voice cold. That's the idea. Carter sighed. All right. Just make sure you don't cross any lines you can't uncross. The next morning, I received a text from Carter with a link to a local blog. I clicked it and was greeted by an article titled, Behind the Gym Doors, Allegations Surface Against the Local Business Owner. The piece was scathing, detailing Jared's history of inappropriate behavior, supported by quotes from anonymous sources. It ended with a call for more women to come forward if they'd had similar experiences. I smirked. It wasn't just the truth, it was justice. By the end of the week, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Jared's gym saw a mass exodus of members, his reputation now tarnished beyond repair. Allison, meanwhile, had retreated into herself, avoiding the neighbors and refusing to speak to me unless it was about the kids. The lawyer's office was a modest building on the edge of downtown, sandwiched between a real estate agency and a nail salon. Its unassuming exterior betrayed nothing of the battles waged within its walls, and as I sat across from Lauren, my divorce attorney, I realized just how clinical this process would need to be. Lauren was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. She was sifting through the file I'd brought, photos, messages, printouts from the sync devices, nodding occasionally as she took it all in. This is a lot, she said finally, closing the folder and leaning back in her chair. But you're in Colorado, Evan, and here's the reality. Infidelity doesn't carry much weight in a no-fault state. The court isn't going to care who cheated. What matters is custody, assets, and support. I nodded, having expected this. What about leverage? I asked. She raised an eyebrow. Leverage? I gestured toward the folder. This isn't just proof of an affair. It's a public scandal. The neighbors know. Jared's business is falling apart. I want to use that, not just for the divorce, but for custody. Lauren considered this for a moment. You can certainly push for favorable terms, but be prepared for pushback. Allison might argue that exposing the affair like this, publicly, shows poor judgment on your part. Courts tend to focus on the children's best interests, not revenge. I'm not trying to take the kids away from her, I said firmly. I just want to make sure Henry and Mia aren't caught in the middle of this mess. Joint custody, but on my terms. Then we'll aim for that, Lauren said, jotting down a note. I'll draft the papers and include a settlement offer. If she's smart, she'll agree to avoid dragging this out in court. Good, I said. That evening, I found Allison sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up when I entered, her expression shifting from weary to desperate. Evan, she began, her voice trembling, we need to talk. I didn't sit. About what? About us, she said. About what happens next. I crossed my arms. What happens next is that I file for divorce. Her eyes filled with tears. Please don't do this. I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head. It's too late for that. It doesn't have to be, she cried, standing up and moving toward me. We built a life together, Evan, a family. Henry and Mia need both of us. Don't throw it all away. I'm not the one who threw it away, I said coldly. You did that the moment you invited Jared into our home. She flinched as if I'd struck her, then clasped her hands together. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't myself. I made a horrible mistake, but it doesn't change how much I love you. Please, Evan, give me a chance to make it right. You still here, unblinking. Do you love him? Her lips trembled. No, it was never about love. It was a distraction. A distraction? I repeated, my voice rising. You tore apart our marriage for a distraction? Tears streamed down her face. I didn't mean to hurt you. Stop, I said, cutting her off. This isn't about me anymore. It's about the kids. I'll make sure they're protected, but you and I are done. She crumpled back into the chair, sobbing quietly as I walked away. The next morning, I received a call from Carter. You're going to love this, he said, his tone laced with satisfaction. What now? Melissa filed for divorce, he said. And get this, she's planning to sue Jared for draining their joint accounts to cover up his mess. Turns out he's been funneling money from their personal savings into the gym, trying to keep it afloat while his reputation tanks. I smirked. Good for her. It gets better, Carter continued. She's talking to a reporter from the Denver Post about going public. She wants to expose him for mismanagement and harassment, and she's got the receipts to back it up. I let out a low whistle. That's going to bury him. Yep, Carter said. You wanted him ruined? Consider it done. By the end of the week, Jared's gym was officially closed. A sign on the door read, "Permanently closed. Thank you for your patronage." The news spread quickly, and Melissa's pending lawsuit became the talk of the town. Allison, meanwhile, had retreated further into herself. She barely left the house, avoiding the neighbors and ignoring calls from friends. The once confident, lively woman I'd married was now a shadow of herself, but I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. The steady dismantling of Jared's life was like watching a slow-motion car crash. By the following week, the gym's closure had hit the local news. A brief segment on the evening broadcast summarized the allegations: financial mismanagement, harassment claims from former clients, and a pending divorce with Melissa that promised to drag even more skeletons into the light. I watched the broadcast from the couch, my phone buzzing intermittently with updates from Carter. Jared had gone dark on social media. No posts, no responses to comments, nothing. He was being erased in real time, reduced to a cautionary tale in the fitness community. By Wednesday, I heard through Carter that Jared had moved into a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. Melissa had frozen their joint accounts, and the lawsuit she'd filed for misappropriation of funds ensured he'd be living on fumes for the foreseeable future. As for Allison, her world wasn't collapsing quite as publicly, but the cracks were impossible to ignore. I noticed it first when she received a phone call in the middle of dinner. She excused herself, stepping into the living room to answer it, but her voice carried back to me. "What do you mean they canceled?" she said, her tone tight. I leaned back in my chair, straining to hear. "No, I didn't know." "Of course, I understand. Thank you for letting me know." She returned to the table a few minutes later, her expression carefully blank. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern. She hesitated, then nodded. "Just a miscommunication with a client." Her tone was even, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. A week later, it happened again. This time, the call came early in the morning while she was making breakfast. I heard snippets as I passed through the kitchen. "But I've worked with them before." "No, I don't think that's necessary." "Right, I understand." When she hung up, I decided to press. "Another miscommunication?" She glanced at me, her cheeks flushing. "Just a client deciding to go in a different direction." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The truth came out the next day when I overheard a conversation between Allison and one of her colleagues, Amber, on a video call. "I don't know what's going on," Allison said, her voice trembling. "I've lost 3 bookings this week, and I can't get anyone to commit for the fall." Amber's face on the screen was sympathetic but hesitant. "You have to know why, Allison. People talk. And with everything that happened, that's not fair." Allison interrupted, her voice rising. "My work has nothing to do with my personal life." Amber sighed. "You're right, it shouldn't. But this town isn't exactly forgiving." I stepped away before they could notice me listening, but the pieces were falling into place. Allison's affair with Jared hadn't just destroyed our marriage. It was poisoning her career. The final blow came later that week. I found her sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine, staring blankly at the yard. "I spoke to Amber today," she said without looking at me. She told me Jared was seeing other women, she continued, her voice flat. Even while he was with me. That caught my attention. Surprised? She turned to me, her eyes filled with something between anger and despair. No, just humiliated. I folded my arms, leaning against the doorframe. You built your castle on sand, Allison. What did you expect? Her expression hardened. You think this is what I deserve? I think it's exactly what you chose, I said evenly. Actions have consequences. She didn't respond, turning back to her glass of wine as if hoping it held the answers she couldn't find. Meanwhile, I focused on Henry and Mia, ensuring their lives remained as stable as possible. I made breakfast every morning, took them to school, and attended every game and recital. When they asked about the changes at home, I kept my answer simple. Mom and Dad are figuring some things out. It wasn't a lie. By the end of the month, Allison had stopped trying to keep up appearances. Her once polished demeanor had given way to a weary resignation. She spent most of her time in the house, avoiding neighbors and barely touching her camera. Jared, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors swirled about him leaving town entirely, though Carter had heard whispers that he was working under the table at a warehouse just to make rent. The day of the divorce hearing was surprisingly calm. I'd expected a storm, a clash of accusations, or some last-ditch effort from Allison to delay the inevitable. But when the judge asked if we both agreed to the terms, Allison simply nodded. The agreement was straightforward. Joint custody of Henry and Mia, with a schedule that gave me equal time with them. No alimony. Allison hadn't fought for it, probably knowing she wouldn't win. The house, already in my name, was mine to keep. She would move out by the end of the month. When the gavel struck, signaling the official end of our marriage, I felt nothing. No relief, no sadness, no triumph. Just a hollow finality. Allison lingered in the hallway after the hearing, her eyes downcast. She didn't try to speak to me, and I didn't offer her any words either. A week later, she packed up the last of her things and left the house for good. The kids were with me that day, so they didn't have to see her drive away with the U-Haul trailing behind her Jeep. I watched from the window as she pulled out of the driveway, heading to a modest rental on the other side of town. According to Carter, she'd taken a job as a receptionist at an outdoor gear shop. It was a far cry from her work as a freelance photographer, but I supposed it was better than nothing. With the house finally my own, I began to make small changes. The bedroom furniture was the first to go, sold off piece by piece, along with anything else that bore the weight of memories I no longer wanted. I repainted the walls, replaced the rugs, and swapped out the old dining table for something smaller and simpler. It wasn't about erasing Allison's presence. It was about reclaiming the space. The kids adjusted more easily than I'd expected. Henry seemed happier now that the tension in the house had lifted, and Mia, at 5, was too young to understand the full extent of what had happened. One evening, while helping Mia with her homework, she looked up at me and asked, "Is Mommy coming back?" "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "But you'll still see her. She loves you very much. Do you still love her?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then smiled softly. "I'll always care about her, because she's your mom. But sometimes grown-ups need to live in different houses to be happy." Mia nodded, accepting the answer without further question. In the weeks that followed, I began to fill my time with new routines. I signed up for a woodworking class at a community center, something I'd always wanted to try, but never found the time for. I started going on long hikes with Carter, exploring trails I hadn't visited in years. Dating, though, was a step I wasn't ready for. Carter teased me about it occasionally, but I waved him off. One step at a time, I told him. The twist came at a school event, a spring festival organized by Henry's class. I was standing near the bake sale table, watching Mia play ring toss, when I saw him. Jared. He was lingering near the edge of the crowd, his once pristine appearance replaced by a rumpled jacket and unshaven face. When he saw me, he hesitated, then started walking over. "Evan," he said awkwardly, stopping a few feet away. "Can we talk?" I crossed my arms, keeping my tone neutral. "What is there to talk about?" He looked down, his hands fidgeting. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I was wrong, and I screwed up." The sincerity in his voice was obvious, but I didn't care. Apologies didn't erase what he'd done. You were wrong, I said evenly. But you weren't just wrong to me. You were wrong to Melissa, to your clients, to everyone who trusted you. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying to make things right. I just wanted you to know that. I stared at him for a moment, then shook my head. You'll have to live with your choices, Jared. Just like the rest of us. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. As I drove home that evening, with Henry and Mia chattering in the back seat about the festival, I realized I felt lighter. Jared's apology hadn't changed anything, but it had marked an end to the chapter. I glanced at the kids in the rearview mirror and smiled. The future was ours to build, one day at a time.